When we think about data, we think about data being a kind of ethereal thing that sort of floats above us from cloud to cloud in some kind of insubstantial way. Of course, that's not true. Every time we exercise rights in relation to our personal data, we're forcing the people holding that data to be holding it in ways that means that it's easily accessible. If we're talking about the use of data within the private sector, I'm absolutely a fan of some form of state regulation, of laws. I always think you have to remember that the tools that have emerged that we think of as AI are based on technologies that have been around since the 1950s. Last Monday, for example, I think I spent the entire day reading the EU AI Act. 90,000 words. So it's a difficult and fraught question, and I'm not convinced that we quite have the right balance yet.
Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Sam Knowles. And joining us today is Alice Wallbank, a professional support lawyer for the law firm Shoosmiths, whose clients include Mercedes-Benz, Octopus Ventures and Travelodge. The company also specialises in working for businesses in both property and the banking sector. The Financial Times has garlanded Shoosmiths as one of Europe's most innovative law firms. And I'd say that Alice's pioneering role at the company, focused on privacy, data and increasingly AI, is symptomatic of a business in the vanguard of a profession catching up with the broadest implications of technology. At the start of this year, Alice co-hosted an excellent data insights conference, naturally hybrid, both in the room and online, which featured a keynote from Austrian activist and lawyer Max Schrems. Schrems, of course, is famous for his successful campaigns against Facebook and Meta for their violations of European data privacy laws. Before joining Shoosmiths, Alice spent 6 years as the principal legal counsel for the Cyber and Information Security Division of the leading technology business QinetiQ. First of all, Alice, welcome to Data Malarkey.
Thank you very much, Sam. Delighted to be here.
Now, it's great to have you with us. I trust that was a decent summary of who you are and what you do. Is there anything that you'd like to add or clarify? Anything I've got wrong?
Just one thing to say. Obviously, as a lawyer, I've first got to start off with a disclaimer, as we always do. Just to say that I'm very much here in my personal capacity. I'm delighted by the opportunities of that working Shoosmiths affords me, and it's a great firm to work for. But like all lawyers, I'm quite opinionated. So any mistakes, any outrageous comments are very, very much my own.
Very good. That's an important point of clarification. Now, before we focus and talk about data and AI, I want to start with a question that's designed to get to the heart of what makes you, you. And it doesn't necessarily ask you to tell us about your work. So tell me, Alice, if you would, how do you spend your time?
I spend my time doing an awful lot of reading and thinking about data. You said I worked as a professional support lawyer. I do indeed. It's a title I really don't like at all because it makes it sound like I have yet to qualify as a lawyer, or in some way I'm in a sort of support role. Actually, professional support lawyers usually are pretty experienced lawyers with some sectoral or in-house experience who are there to be given a space really within a legal team to have time and resources to really think about the difficult questions that are thrown at us and to have the time to read some of the stuff. I mean, last Monday, for example, I think I spent the entire day reading the EU AI Act. 90,000 words, a not inconsiderable novel. I don't know how many other people had time to do it, and it's got some real, exciting twists and turns in it, in fact. But it's that sort of opportunity that I'm afforded, and then that goes into client-facing work, training, horizon scanning, information, put out there for the benefit of clients and the wider community.
We will come back and touch on AI without doubt during the course of our discussion. But I think one question for any of the mass available large language models might be, can you think of a better title for Alice based on our discussion than professional support lawyer? Listen, I'm just following what you yourself, I think, could put on LinkedIn. But I agree. And also, I have got an enormous amount of respect for those businesses, yours included, that actually are prepared to invest in the time or in roles that allow people to get their heads around the minutiae, because I'm sure there are plenty of, as you say, plot twists and cliffhangers and so on in the EU AI Act that will have significant implications on your clients' businesses, on all businesses, and that people just do not have the time to do. So I think that's a hugely important role that enables the businesses to do business. Now, one of the defining characteristics of the information technology and the big data revolution is that, while everyone's talking about it, few companies and sectors are actually using it to their competitive advantage. The legal profession, probably unfairly, has a reputation for being traditional and slow to innovate, even if we have moved beyond quill pens and parchment. How far advanced would you say today's law firms, today's legal industry are in terms of embracing the power of data and technology?
I would say largely pretty good, actually. Obviously, it's going to depend on the sector. I mean, working in a sector like privacy and data, anything tech-related, anything contract-related, anything commercial nowadays, there is no way you can be a functioning law firm without doing some pretty serious consideration of the technology that's out there. I mean, clients expect it, we expect it. It's a competitive industry, and you've got to stay ahead of the game. And sometimes it can be client-led. I mean, to take us back just for a moment, in 1997, I would say, when I was training in a city firm, a major client of ours, who was a fast food retailer, suddenly announced, most unexpectedly, that they wanted us to deal with something called email, which was the latest thing that was coming along. Gosh, we said, wow, what's that? We haven't even got PCs on our desks. And they delivered something that I think looked like a sort of small fridge or something that would sit in the middle of the office in what was then the typing pool. And once a day, somebody would go and have to consult the machine and see whether or not this very, very forward-facing client had sent us one or more messages, at which point, of course, it would have to be printed off and delivered into the in-tray of the relevant lawyer, because, of course, we couldn't actually receive them on our desk. But nonetheless, that's an example of where clients really expect you to be up with it and for you to lead the way. And certainly, I mean, working in the world of privacy and data, we are helping clients all the time think about data management and about efficient and effective ways of handling just the absolutely unimaginable amounts of data that people have to handle now. And I mean, one example, under the GDPR, I mentioned it already, gosh. Under the GDPR, we as individuals have the right to ask anybody who is handling our personal data, what are you holding about me, and can I have a copy, please? And this results in these things called DSARs, data subject access requests, which, some organizations will receive thousands per week. And sometimes they're made in quite difficult contexts. But nonetheless, I mean, you can imagine how difficult it is when you're answering a request from someone who's been embedded in an organization. Imagine how difficult it is to fish that out in a legally compliant way and review it and send it all back to them within the statutory time period. I mean, that's the sort of place where the kinds of tools and platforms that are being developed now are just brilliant at doing that, at helping clients to deal with those. So that, that's a sort of obvious example. And it happens at every level. I mean, I guess I'm sure we'll get on to be talking about generative AI and all those tools in due course. But obviously, people are having a very good think about how they may be useful in the future as well.
Very good. Your anecdote about your fast food restaurant with the email fridge reminds me of a brother of mine who, possibly even a couple of years after that, held a very senior role in a very big top 3 global pharma business. And the only way to get his attention, or the only way to get onto his email radar, you had to email his PA, who would have some guidelines. And at the end of every day, she would choose the 10 most important emails that had arrived, print them off, and then fax them to him as he left the building, so he could read them when he got home. Amazing how things change in development. Now you mentioned that You mentioned that initialism, infamous initialism GDPR a couple of times. Quick fire question for you: good or bad GDPR? Is it good? Is it good for lawyers advising businesses on potential pitfalls, or is it achieving what the EU intended in terms of actual data privacy for individuals?
What a brilliant question. Unequivocally a good thing. Absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt. A few things I'll say about the GDPR. Number one, it came in, we first saw it looming over the horizon in 2016, and then it became operative in 2018. But it is actually based on a directive which came in 1995. 1995, so, pre-fridge-like emails. I mean, how extraordinary that a piece of legislation that people were forward-looking enough and intelligent enough to have a think about what was coming over the horizon and to try and put something in place, which even today is, it has not changed much. It is still there. It has been refined a little bit with various court cases and so on. It is hugely influential worldwide. I was reading something only the other day about a fine which has been imposed now in Nigeria against one of the big tech companies, $200 million. The very kernel of that claim that they're making against these tech companies is that although in Nigeria there is a general data protection regulation called the Nigerian DPR, tech companies are not taking data protection as seriously in Nigeria as they are in Europe and the UK for, they say, discriminatory reasons. And so it is a useful tool, not just within Europe. I mean, it is influential the world over, and with some very interesting effects in the US, which is obviously coming from a very different place from a kind of legal landscape point of view. Just one more thing to say about the GDPR. If you read Article 1 of the GDPR, it says two things. Number one, it says, this regulation is here to protect the fundamental rights and freedoms of individuals. Us, against the unimaginably powerful forces of big digital technology, regulator and consumer forces. Number two, it says, this regulation is here in order to promote the free flow of data within the European Union. So what it's doing is it's saying you can share data. You can share personal data about people. Yeah, that's fine. But if you want to do that, you have to conform to these particular standards and expectations, which are going to be the same in all countries so that there can be the free flow of data. So the GDPR is doing two things. It's protecting people, but it's also making an open market in data, which, after all, is what all the innovators want. And if we didn't have it, I argue that we would have the situation where, in a panic, a lot of nations would have closed down data flows completely because there wouldn't be anywhere safe to send it to. And we'd have massive data localization, which is a thing that goes on in some countries in the world now for economic and political reasons. What a shame that would be. And actually all these exciting projects and products and apps and, all this stuff wouldn't be happening. So I'm a big fan.
Very good. I love the fact that you point us to the first 2 points in Article 1. You've read the whole thing probably many times. You can probably recite it. But I love the fact you point us to something in Article 1. What about the hidden costs of GDPR? I know you've written about this topic recently.
I have. When we think about data, we think about data being a kind of ethereal thing that sort of floats above us from cloud to cloud in some kind of insubstantial way. Of course, that's not true. Data is a deeply physical product that relies on a lot of resource, and it needs somewhere to be stored, and it lives in places that need a lot of cooling and a lot of water and so on. So actually, it is deeply really part of the conversation we all need to have about, the environment and where we're heading. And the GDPR is very interesting from that point of view because it plays on both sides of that, if you like. On the one hand, all the stuff about making sure you've got a good reason for keeping data and that you can only do it within certain parameters and you've got to throw away all the data you don't want. All those rules in the GDPR obviously help that mission, if you like, not to use too many resources. But there are other bits that are more problematic. Every time we exercise rights in relation to our personal data, we're forcing the people holding that data to be holding it in ways that means that it's easily accessible, which is, of course, more expensive. So it's quite a complicated interplay. And, I haven't got the answers. I'm hoping that people more intelligent than me have the answers. But it opens up a lot of interesting conversations about where we're heading with data.
And I'm well aware that some of the debate around AI, of course, given the trillions of calculations that need to be answered, and even a relatively trivial prompt in a generative AI, a large language model, generate significantly more amounts of energy required and more cooling and the rest of it. So I think I'll include a link in the show notes to your piece. I was taken by your piece about the hidden costs of GDPR and the sheer physicality of data, because as you say, people do feel the cloud is some sort of beneficent Simpsons type fluffy white thing that sits in the cloud, but it sits above us, but actually rather not. And now since the UK left the EU, I mean, I remember there was a lot of talk by both the disgraced former Prime Minister Johnson and his disgraced lackey Cummings about GDPR not applying. But since the UK has left the EU, have things got better or worse for companies and citizens in particular in the UK? I'm being parochial for a moment.
A really interesting question. After Brexit, the GDPR was embedded into UK law, for want of a better way of putting it. So we now have the UK GDPR. So we do have something with basically the same wording for the moment. There's a few little tweaks and things that they've made, but it is essentially the same idea. And we still have the Data Protection Act, which is a sort of the other enormous pillar of data protection law in the UK. So to that extent, things haven't really changed. And we've still got the regulator, the Information Commissioner's Office, the ICO, which is the main personal data regulator. So to that extent, actually, as yet, things have not diverged very much. There's been a bit of an attempt by the previous government to make some reforms. And actually, interestingly and somewhat unexpectedly, it's been taken up by the new government as well. So we are expecting a bit of a reform bill to go on, and they're going to have a think about some of the more difficult definitions. They're going to have a think about new and benign uses of data, which have really surfaced since the GDPR was incepted, particularly in things like health research, scientific research, and so on, trying to make the balance a little bit easier for in a good cause, if you like. There is a big reason, though. I mean, it is possible that we could diverge, and suddenly they would decide that actually they don't want this very, very restrictive, in some people's view, data laws. But there's a really good reason why that won't happen, I don't think, and that is because, I mean, it's a sort of trade question, like the rest of Brexit, really, in that we want to still be able to send data to the European Union and to all those countries who, off the back of our certification, if you like, under GDPR, we can send data to. And as soon as we have laws which are markedly less restrictive than the GDPR is, then we will lose that accreditation, the adequacy decision, as it's called, which will make data flow very, very difficult, which will have not a good effect for innovation, for business, for anybody really.
Yeah, that's really interesting to see that happening, and given the new government, I mean, at the time of recording, it has plenty of issues on its plate, some of which have generated, it appears, by misinformation, riots, and so forth. But it's really interesting to hear that you're not expecting any great rowback, not least because innovation and kind of renewal and growth is such a central part of that government strategy. I want to turn to artificial intelligence, if I can. From your legal privacy and data perspective, how does the sudden widespread availability of AI tools make you feel? As a subnote, I don't know if you know it, but there's a website called There's an AI for That, and at last look, I think there was something like 13,500 different AI tools that one could use. I think there are 87 that can tell you what to make for dinner out of what's in your fridge, for example. Anyway, how does AI make you feel from a legal perspective, data privacy? Does it make you feel terrified, excited, a combination of the two, something else entirely?
I think I'm going to be a little bit controversial for a while. For me personally, I have the same feeling about the current state of AI, if you like, as I do, or as they say that people in the trenches did about, warfare, which is, the mixture of boredom and terror. I have to confess that although I do totally appreciate that there are, within some specific data management tasks, there are very useful things that this stuff can do. If we're thinking about, I don't know, radiography diagnostics or something like that, my goodness, I'm not here to say that's not a good thing. But I always think you have to remember that the tools that have emerged that we think of as AI at the moment are based on technologies that have been around since the 1950s. All that's happened is that we've got very, 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 very big pools of data, an enormous computing system now, computing power now, which means that we can see that the ways in which data is being manipulated, the predictive powers are being extracted from it, it's being shuffled around in various ways. It's all very exciting. But at heart, it's still a closed box. All you're doing is fiddling around with, if you imagine the internet as a big box, you're just fiddling around with whatever data that you've put into your system. Well, it could be the internet, it could be from sensors from a machine or something, but that's all that you're doing. And so for me, for the moment, I have to confess that I feel a kind of mixture of, oh, lovely party tricks, isn't that amazing? But also a feeling of that there's a limit to it. It's a little bit self-limiting. And, we know all the effects about the fact that if there are particular biases in the stuff that you put in, then there will be biases in the stuff you get out. And so for me, I think I have to confess, much as I hate to say it, it's at the moment, I've yet to be impressed. So that's the boredom element. The terror element is there a capability out there which can hook in some way to the real world? In other words, if this enormous capacity to learn, to develop, to compute, it can somehow be hooked on to the real world, have real world inputs, have real understanding of what's going on in the world, then it's game over, as far as I'm concerned, for humanity. Perhaps I'm being a little bit dramatic there, but that will have absolutely extraordinary effects on humanity. We're not there yet. There's a big debate about who should have, should we be letting that power potentially, if it is doable? There's still people nobody knows really to what extent that is doable. If it is doable, who should have the power over that? Is it right that should be in the hands of a few tech companies in 1 or 2 or 3 countries in the world, or not? Should it be looked after by some other body?
Can I get a bit philosophical or a bit poetic with you for a second? I was originally, as you know, and the listeners to this podcast will know, because I often make reference. I was originally, before I got into data, well, I'd say it was the same thing. I was originally a classicist, and the Roman satirist Juvenal, who might guard the guards, who might watch the watchers. In terms of data privacy and protection, should that be a state function? Do you feel, and I'm asking you for your own opinion here, whereas in fact, in large part, these are domains that are addressed by the private sector. It's big tech that regulates itself right now. They guard themselves by and large. Okay. GDPR may have led to some eye-watering fines if only these companies weren't making eye-wateringly very much more, and so it's just it's an irritant to them. Alice, who should guard the guards? Who should it's for AI? Who should guard the guards in this case?
I would say very much, if we're talking about the use of data within the private sector, I'm absolutely a fan of some form of state regulation, of laws. I mean, I hear what you're saying about fines not being adequate. I agree with you. I mean, there are problems with enforcement. That said, I mean, if we are to believe them, tech companies have, they have different terms and conditions in what they can do in Europe than what they can do in the US, for example. They do different things to data. So there is, it's not just fines. It's also, it does make a material difference to what happens on the ground. And that is very, very much needed, I think. I'm not a fan of the idea of complete self-regulation. I think we've seen, if we take ourselves away from data for a moment and think about other big ecosystems in the world which are self-regulated, I think human experience tells us that the drivers just to make money are just overwhelming, and they overwhelm the individual. And so I'm a very, very big fan of state regulation at some level for data. Okay, so that's one. There's then flipping that on the head and saying, well, technology also affords governments an awful lot of technological ability. If we think about facial recognition, for example, we just had the Prime Minister the other day saying, actually, I want to expand powers for the police to be able to use facial recognition technologies. And so the question is, well, who guards them? And I mean, one thing that I'm very interested in is the interplay between the private sector and the public sector, and data's use or technology's use in law enforcement and the intelligence services. And wondering whether the arrangements that are being put in place are sufficient to protect you and me from all this. I mean, it's a very, very big question, and it's going to be influenced to a huge degree by, where you sit on the political spectrum and what particular thing that you're concerned about. But I always think, when people are protesting about something that you personally utterly disagree with, it's all very easy to say, oh yes, facial recognition technology is a terribly good thing. But then if you spin that round and put that or imagine that was involved in something that you feel very, you personally feel very strongly about, and you would like to exercise the right to protest over, for example, suddenly you see, no, actually, hang on a moment, what are we doing? What are we doing? So it's a difficult and fraught question, and I'm not convinced that we quite have the right balance yet.
I think you're quite right, and I think that I think the history of self-regulation is not brilliant. I mean, I spent 3 or 4 years in the early 90s working with the social aspects organizations in the international drinks industry that had lofty ambitions to tackle alcohol misuse, reduce alcohol-related harm, and so on and so forth, and promote sensible drinking. They said, this isn't the same as smoking. This is, and it's not the same thing. It's not any drink is bad for you, but obviously excessive consumption. And it was really interesting within the kind of the confines of the organisation, and working with the international booze barons, as they were termed, to see that when commercial realities really squeaked, when an organisation said, well, we should campaign for the lowering of the drink drive limit to make the UK the same as the EU. Those companies that owned no pubs and just made and sold wines and spirits said, yes, we should do that. And those brewers, and the structure of the industry has totally changed, those brewers who owned lots of pubs said, you're going to kill our rural trade. And then the spirits guys could get on their high horses and say, well, your business model is condoning illegal drink driving. And of course, it would all end. But my feeling is that that big tech has grown in a way a bit like, Dracula running a blood bank, or the mafia running a crime protection board, or indeed leaving your cat to look after the goldfish when you go away on holiday. I'm with you. I think regulation and legislation is important. Now, listen, you teased us by telling us about this 90,000 word novel that you read last Monday, the EU's proposed AI regulation. What's your view of how national and transnational bodies are tackling privacy and data issues that are raised by AI? Are they off to a good start, would you say?
Well, turning to the EU AI Act, now I have read it, I'm very interested in essentially what it's trying to do, because when we talk about AI, everyone gets terribly excited, and it's easy to kind of get lost in this sort of existential threat piece, and oh goodness me, how should we be? What should we be doing about it? And everyone's tearing their hair out. Actually, what the EU has done in a quite a prosaic way, but actually quite sensible way, I think, is to think this: what we're getting is products which are based on AI in all sorts of manifestations. What do we do with products that we're not very sure about? I know what we do. We have product compliance legislation, so that when I, plug in my electric kettle, it won't explode in my face because it's got a CE marking on it and someone's checked it, and there are standards to it, and I have to, if I want to import this stuff and put it on the market, I have to show that within certain parameters it is safe, and that I will keep documentation that you can have a look at, and all the rest of it. So in a terribly, terribly prosaic way, the EU AI Act is product compliance legislation. It's taking a pretty pragmatic view, actually, which lots of people, when they're talking about EU law, I mean, the great temptation is to think, it's a great ideological sort of push. I would say this actually isn't an ideological push. It's based in, this is how you're going to do your certification. This is who your market surveillance authorities are going to be. And because I'm sure, as you know, there is a massive, very, very mature product compliance regulatory system in Europe into which this hooks beautifully. And actually, I think for me, that sort of answers some of the question about why the US has been taking a different approach. Actually, it is because they don't have this enormous unified federal product compliance ecosystem on which to hook it. And so they're doing, so far, they're taking a little bit of a different stand. I mean, the great cliche about US regulation, I would say, is that on the whole, they let the market do what it's going to do, and then they allow enormous class actions, expensive class actions to pick up the pieces. We're seeing a little bit more proactive stuff coming from the US on AI, largely, I think, driven by the fact that because, again, they've had problems bringing in federal privacy legislation at all, there's very, very little to hook it onto. And there is a concern about that the market in data sharing, if you like, which is very, very mature in the US, has some national security implications. And so off the back of that, there are some national security implication-driven pieces about AI, and a whole lot of other state stuff in the offing, if you like, but not at the same level of maturity.
Really, really, really interesting. When you talk about the US approach of one, finding it so difficult to do things federally, and two, kind of letting the market rip and then allowing there to be class actions, it makes me wonder whether, and I'm not asking you to voice an opinion on this, but it makes me wonder whether one of the reasons that there hasn't been the opioid addiction crisis in Europe is because Purdue were allowed to get away with it until actually they were found out, and then a class action happened. I mean, the family still managed to get away with murder hundreds of thousands, but also a lot of their own money, even if the business doesn't exist anymore. But I hang that out there, not expecting there to be an answer and a parallel, but it does make me think this principle of the market comes first, and then we'll sort it out after the mess has happened might be one of the reasons for that. So I want to turn before I ask you before we wrap up. I want to turn to the sometimes murky world of online dating. And this has come back into the fore recently. In 2015, the Discreet Affairs website, Ashley Manson, suffered this enormous data breach. I think it exposed the personal and the financial details of 35 million of its members around the world, maybe more than that. And the breach was recently subject of a 3-part Netflix documentary, which was maybe a bit as TV. Maybe it was a bit cliffhanger. They could have done it in 1 hour rather than 3. But anyway, I know you've written about it recently, and we'll share notes to that excellent piece as well. Based on your knowledge of the sector and how things have changed over the past decade, would you say that scale of data breach could happen today?
In a word, yes. I think there's obviously, I mean, things have come an enormously long way. Gosh, we've got a whole lot of cyber-related data protection legislation. I mean, obviously, that is the other side of data protection, if you like. If we're not thinking about personal data rights, we are thinking about the drivers to cybersecurity that are written into various data protection laws. And this is a sort of case in point, really. We've come an enormously long way. And I mean, if I can take one thing that I think has changed, I mean, we've got now laws coming in pretty much everywhere in the EU, in the UK, in the US, all driving at forcing incident reporting on companies of particular, who are either holding very important data or who are part of critical infrastructure and so on. And I think that has been driven by an acknowledgement that leaving those decisions about whether or not to fess up that you've been the subject of a ransomware attack, leaving that in the hands of the people who've been attacked, is that they're not always going to make the call which prioritizes the public good. Because if you don't know what's going on, it's very difficult for national cybersecurity agencies to help the sector as a whole to understand what the drivers of ransomware attacks are. And so that is changing, I think. One really interesting aspect, I think, of that data breach was that it happened at a time when this company was, it was taking on seemingly millions of new customers over a very, very short space of time. It was, the victim of its own success, if you like. And I think that's something that hasn't changed. I mean, how many companies do we know of who are having a great time and are a victim of their own success in a way? For example, they just don't have an IT platform that is up to the job. No one's got any time to sort it out. It's the last job that you'll sort out. We'll sort out as soon as things get a bit quieter and all the rest of it. That hasn't changed. Those pressures are still absolutely there, I think.
No, I think it's very interesting. I think some things have got better, but actually, it's perfectly possible it could happen again. Now, listen. Of course, we have to have a Columbo question. In the way that you read and think and work with data and data privacy, is there anything that I haven't asked you that I should have asked you?
Well, Sam, I'm very, very shocked that you haven't asked me what my favourite privacy and data related pop song is.
Alice, what is your favourite privacy and data related pop song?
Okay, Sam. Take yourself back to 1984, which is, of course, a key year for the privacy and data community. Imagine that you're in the nightclub. I'm in my white stilettos. I think you might be in your pixie boots, possibly. I'm going to take my white stilettos off because they're a bit uncomfortable, but I'm dancing around my handbag. What am I dancing to? I am dancing to Sometimes I feel like somebody's watching me and I get no privacy. Oh, of course, I'm just realising that I've just caused a copyright problem, terrible dimensions, which as a lawyer is probably not a great thing, but nonetheless, that is by Rockwell. And it's absolutely extraordinary. I mean, it's 40 years old, but if you read it now, it's got all sorts of stuff about how, the IRS, which is obviously the US HMRC, is going to be looking at what we're doing. We're going to have no privacy on our phones. and all the rest of it. I just love it.
Well, listen, you've Alice, you've taken us right back to 1984. Two, it's a Data Malarkey first. I don't think we've had anyone sing on the podcast before, so you've set the bar very high there. So thank you very much. Now, listen. You said that you right at the beginning. You said that you spend you're afforded the luxury of the time to do things like read the EU AI Act and to think about it. You're also very productive in what you write. I've made reference to a number of articles that are obviously on Ashley Madsen and other things that I'll include links to. Where can our viewers, our listeners, find out about you and what you're up to online? Social media. Is there anywhere in particular, apart from those articles, that you were directing to?
Oh, Sam, I wish I could say yes. I'm, as a privacy and data maven, I'm afraid I don't do social media at all. So obviously you can find out about what the firm's doing, what other people in the firm are writing as well, which is of great interest just on the Shoosmiths website. And I have contact details. Gosh, I'm on the end of a phone and I have an email address. So, if anyone's interested in stuff, then by all means get in touch. But I'm sorry, I don't really. I inform some of the posting that goes on from the wider team, but I don't personally post.
Very good. Well, I think that speaks volumes. Alice, thank you so much for your time. I think if there were any more people with your approach to using data smarter, there'd be rather less malarkey in the world of data privacy and the law, and rather more data-driven common sense. Alice Wallbank, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much for listening to Data Malarkey. To find out what kind of data storyteller you are, why not take our data storytelling scorecard? It takes just 2 minutes to complete and will give you a personalised report right away. Visit data-storytelling.scoreapp.com or follow the link in the show notes.